I made a video last year that I want to go over before we get, too thick into the, the draft content and stuff. We're already here. We're already talking draft stuff. But I want to talk about PFF grades and what they mean in terms of evaluating draft prospects. And the reality is they actually do mean something depending on the position. There is some correlations that are really helpful and actually are things I think people should be paying more attention to, but it's that specific position. Because this is everyone's grade. What basically I have to explain what this chart is, but this was every single first round player. I looked at where they ranked in terms of their PFF grade. This was over, I believe, the past 10 years, not counting last year, because again, this is a video I made last year. But every single player that was, that was drafted in the first round, what was their PFF grade the last year they were in college, and then how good did they end up being? Now, how good are you is definitely subjective, but my subjective grading scale was on a scale of 1 to 4, with 4 being the best. So you see, the average player who had a grade of 90 or better ended up with a score of being a player who was 2.76, which is the best score, although it gets a bit wonky here on this chart. While it does seem to have some sort of correlation with the 90, 80, and 70, when you get down to players that were in the 60s, you then actually have a jump again. So the worst row there is the 70s, which makes you wonder, okay, well, how much can we take PFF grades seriously then if there's still plenty of players who have been successful who have had grades in the 60s, which is why, in my opinion, it's much more important to look at the individual positions instead of looking at the chart itself. That's, the whole players altogether is kind of how I view it. Like, for example, safeties, there's a huge correlation with them. Safeties, the safeties that had over a 90 grade end up being very good. A score of 3, I should say. Whereas in the 80s, it's still a solid 2.5. And players with grades in the 70s tend to not hit, although an exception was Kyle Hamilton actually did not have a great grade last year, but still was very successful. Because again, this is not a end-all be-all. What you should do with this is say, okay, if you like a player who had a bad PFF grade, there should be an explanation for it. And the explanation, in my opinion, cannot be, well, I don't like PFF. Like, that's not a sufficient enough explanation for me. I want to know more about it. But if there is explanations, like I think there was for Hamilton, I think he was used wrong. Not used wrong, but he was just given so much responsibility in Notre Dame that because of that, his grade was going to go down. That's probably the reason why it happened. That's a fine reason. There are reasons for exceptions, but there should be a reason there, and you probably shouldn't chase exceptions even though they do happen. As for cornerbacks, this is an interesting one because for players who had over a 90 grade, they did perform the best. But then when you get into kind of players under 90, so from the difference of, in the 80s or below 80, it was actually better when you were below 80 than when you were above 80. Just kind of interesting the way that one worked. Wide receivers is another one without a huge correlation because while the players above 90 did end up being a little bit better, again, you have a scenario where the 80s was lower than 70s here. But going over to edge, we get to some here where there's massive correlations. Edge, honestly, edge probably has the biggest correlation out of any of them, where you have players that get above 90 grade, they end up, being great typically. The ones who are in the 80s end up being solid, and the ones in the 70s almost never hit. It's really rare for a player that has a below 80 PFF grade to hit at the next level, and usually it takes a couple of years when they do hit, like a Rashawn Gary type situation. So be very wary of drafting a player who has a grade below 80 if you are a GM watching this video, which I am sure you are not. Interior defensive lineman isn't as significant, but still significant. You do still see a trend here as the players with better grades tend to go on to be better players. Guys above 90 tend to be better. I split it up from the 85 to 89 and then sub 85 here, just because that was how I got the sample size as close to even on all three categories, which that was the goal. But you still see a clear correlation here. As for offensive line, as you might have expected, offensive line also has a very similar correlation to, if you play well in college, you tend to play well at the NFL level. And again, these kind of things do make a little bit of sense, right? Because we always talk about, football, very different than like baseball, where analytics are king now. Because in football, there's no way of knowing, it's not these one-on-one matchups. There's so much other stuff going on. And while that still is true with offensive and defensive linemen, it's less true there. It still is a lot of times a series of one-on-one matchups. So kind of using baseball-style statistics can actually work and help evaluate not just NFL players, but college players. But then we have some weird ones like linebackers, which are, there's maybe a correlation here because like the players who graded below 80 just did not hit. In the sample size I used, not a single one hit. So that's concerning if you like a prospect that is below 80, certainly. But above it, there doesn't seem to be a huge correlation from having an 82 grade or a 95 grade. It doesn't seem like there's a real jump there. And in fact, the 80 players in the 80s ended up being a little bit higher than the 90s, which I assume is just random happenstance. Also, like for tight ends, you have a scenario where the players who had a grade above 90 ended up being very good, but there doesn't seem to be a huge drop-off from a guy who was an 87 versus a 77. That doesn't seem to matter too much. So, again, these kind of things could tell you something. Could tell you that the guys who, had really good PFF grades could still be very good at the NFL, or it could just mean that it's kind of fluky here, or maybe there isn't a big enough sample size. It's hard to say exactly. As for running backs, I've seen basically no correlation here. I mean, again, I guess you could argue the players who were below 80, those were the ones that were, not very good. But even that, it's still a score of 2. It's not a terrible score as a whole. This is one where I would not pay much attention to PFF grades. I would use my own evaluation. That's how I feel about it personally. And finally, the one we're all here to see, quarterbacks, which probably has the worst correlation out of any of them. I mean, again, the one thing you can maybe point to is the guys who had below in 85. I did 85.1. I'm not sure why I did that, not just 85. Maybe there was a few players that had 85.1, and I wanted to make the sample size more even. I don't know, but can't remember exactly why I did that. But the players who performed poorly, PFF grades, did tend to miss, but at the same time, you have like a Josh Allen who had a bad grade his last year, but ended up still being awesome, obviously. So he would have been well below the cutoff for being in the middle category here, but he still had, he's having a good career. But the players who have above 90 grades don't really seem to hit at a high level. It's really hard to project quarterbacks in general. And so while we're all looking for the perfect way to project quarterbacks, this is one that you can't really look towards. And the reality is, because that's where everyone's looking, people go to that first. They say, oh, well, PFF can't predict quarterbacks, so why do I care about it? And they throw it out. Even though there's a lot of stuff they can predict well, you just have to look past the stuff they can't. So in conclusion, what have we learned here? Well, first we've learned that the positions that you should pay attention to the grades are, I think clearly are defensive line, offensive line, and safeties. I think if you're evaluating that and you don't pay attention to the PFF grades, I think that you're not going to get as good of an evaluation because of that. Those are positions that tend to have high correlations, and they're ones that I would pay attention to. The ones that I still think you should pay attention to, but maybe you don't have to pay that much attention to, are like wide receivers, cornerbacks, linebackers, and tight ends. Those are the ones where I kind of feel like pay attention to it, but I don't know how much you need to know about it, but you should pay attention to it. It should be something that you at least look at when you're doing your evaluation. The ones that I'm fine with just not even really looking at, if you don't want to, are halfbacks and quarterbacks. I think that there's so much variance there. I think it's fine to not even pay attention to that stuff. That's kind of how I view all of this. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.